Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The night felt ordinary, maybe even a little too quiet. After a long day at the office, Brian unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of home wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. He could hear the soft hum of the dishwasher from the kitchen, the faint clink of plates as his wife, Eliza, moved about, cleaning up after dinner. "Hey, babe," called out, slipping off his shoes and setting his briefcase by the door. No response. He frowned, wondering if she had heard him. The house was still, too still for his liking. Usually Eliza would greet him, a warm smile on her face. Or maybe she'd be curled up on the couch watching her shows, her legs tucked beneath her. Brian found her in the kitchen, her back turned to him as she wiped down the counter. Something felt off. She was stiff, too focused on the mundane task of cleaning. When she turned around, her smile was there, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice just a little too bright. "Long," Brian replied, studying her closely. "You okay?" "Yeah, just tired," she answered quickly, avoiding his gaze as she rinsed her hands and dried them on a towel. "Dinner's in the fridge if you're hungry." Brian nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Eliza seemed distant, distracted. He couldn't pinpoint it, but after years of being married, you start to notice when things aren't right. She'd been acting strange for weeks now, long silences, excuses for why she was getting home late, the way she clutched her phone a little too tightly. But whenever he asked, she'd brush it off, saying she was stressed or that work was just crazy. He opened the fridge, pulling out the leftovers she'd saved for him, but before he could heat them up, the doorbell rang. It was the way the sound cut through the quiet that made him freeze. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, he didn't think much of it, but then he saw it the way Eliza's entire body tensed, her fingers tightening around the towel in her hands. She didn't move, didn't even blink. "Eliza?" Brian asked, his voice low, trying to gauge her reaction. "So, I'll get it," she stammered, dropping the towel as she hurried out of the kitchen, her movements too quick, too nervous. "No, I've got it," Brian said, already heading toward the door. Something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his gut, a gnawing sense of unease that had been growing for weeks, now bubbling up to the surface. When he opened the door, two police officers stood on the porch, their faces stern under the dim porch light. "Good evening, sir," one of them said, his voice professional but firm. "Is this the residence of Eliza Turner?" Brian felt his heart skip a beat. "Yes, it is. Is something wrong? So I'd like to come in and speak with both of you," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Behind him, Brian heard Eliza gasp, her breath catching in her throat. He turned to see her standing at the entrance to the hallway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Eliza?" Brian asked, his voice barely more than a whisper now, but she didn't respond. She stood frozen, her gaze locked on the officers as if they were ghosts from her past come to haunt her. The officer stepped inside, and Brian could feel the shift in the air. Whatever was happening, it was serious. "Is there a problem?" he asked again, more firmly this time, trying to regain control of the situation, though his heart pounded in his chest. "We need to ask your wife some questions," the officer said, glancing between Brian and Liza. "It's in relation to an ongoing investigation involving a Conrad O'Brien." At the mention of the name, Brian saw the brief flicker of panic that crossed Eliza's face. It was like watching her mask slip for just a moment before she tried to collect herself, but it was too late. The damage was done. Brian wasn't sure who this Conrad O'Brien was, but from the way Eliza reacted, he knew this wasn't just some casual acquaintance. I don't know what this is about," Eliza stammered, her voice shaky now. This must be a mistake. But Brian wasn't buying it. He could see it in her eyes, the fear, the guilt. Something was terribly wrong, and it was clear she knew exactly what was going on. "Eliza," Brian said slowly, trying to control the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "Who was Conrad O'Brien?" She didn't answer. Instead, she just stood there, her hands trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. And in that moment, Brian felt the ground shift beneath him. The woman he had trusted with everything, the woman he thought he knew was hiding something. And whatever it was about to tear their lives apart. The officers moved deeper into the house, and Brian stepped back, his mind spinning. Eliza was still frozen in the hallway, staring at the floor, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. "Eliza," Brian said again, his voice sharper now, "tell me the truth." But she didn't. She couldn't. Because the truth was about to destroy everything. Brian's head was spinning. He stood in the doorway, the cool night air drifting in from behind him as the police officers made their way inside. His wife, Eliza, hadn't moved, her eyes glued to the floor, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. The name Conrad O'Brien rang in his ears, unfamiliar yet somehow already threatening everything he thought he knew about his life. "Eliza?" Brian said, his voice low but firm, stepping toward her. "Who is Conrad O'Brien?" Her eyes flicked up to meet his, but she quickly looked away, as if the weight of her own guilt was too heavy to bear. The officers stood near the kitchen, their presence suffocating. Brian knew this was no casual visit, no misunderstanding. I don't, Eliza began, but her voice cracked, trailing off into silence. Brian could feel the anger rising in his chest, bubbling up like lava, threatening to explode. He clenched his fists, fighting to keep his voice steady. Don't lie to me, Eliza. Just tell me the truth. Who is this guy? Her lip trembled as she glanced at the officers, then back at Brian. Her eyes were red and glassy, as if the confession had been sitting inside her, festering, and now that it was coming to the surface, it was tearing her apart. She whispered, barely able to get the words out. A friend. To friend. The word felt like a slap to the face. Brian's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together as the room closed in around him. He wasn't stupid. There was more to this than she was letting on. Much more. A friend? He repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. The cops are here because of your friend? The officers, sensing the tension, stood back but didn't leave. One of them pulled out a notepad, flipping it open and jotting down notes, watching Eliza carefully. Brian noticed it too, the way their eyes never left her, how they seemed to already know what she was going to say, as if this wasn't their first time dealing with women in her position. Eliza, you need to explain this, Brian said, taking a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, even though every instinct told him to shake the truth out of her. What the hell is going on? But Eliza didn't speak. She just shook her head, tears rolling down her cheeks, her body trembling. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, choking the air out of the room. The lead officer finally stepped forward, his voice soft yet firm. Mrs. Turner, we've been investigating Conrad O'Brien for some time now. He's involved in some serious criminal activities. We've gathered evidence that ties him to various illegal enterprises, money laundering, racketeering, drug distribution. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Your name came up during our investigation. Brian's stomach dropped. He felt like someone had just punched him in the gut, knocking the wind out of him. His mind was reeling, trying to process what was being said. Eliza's name? Involved with a criminal? I don't know what they're talking about. Eliza suddenly burst out, her voice high-pitched and frantic. This is a mistake. I barely even know him. Barely know him? The words echoed in Brian's mind. His suspicion deepened, his anger swirling into a storm inside him. Eliza was lying, he could see it in her eyes. The way her gaze darted away every time he looked at her. She was terrified, and not just because of the police. There was something else, something deeper, that she was hiding from him. Brian stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Eliza, look at me. She turned her tear-streaked face toward him, her eyes filled with guilt and fear. His heart ached seeing her like this, but the pain only fueled his anger. Tell me the truth, he demanded. Are you involved with this guy? Did you sleep with him? The question hung in the air like a guillotine, ready to fall. Brian's chest tightened as he waited, dreading the answer but needing to hear it. Eliza's lip quivered, her eyes welling up with fresh tears. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered, barely audible. It was a mistake. I'm so sorry, Brian. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world around Brian faded into a dull hum, and all he could hear were the echoes of her words. It was a mistake. The words felt like shards of glass slicing through him. His hands shook, his vision blurred, but the rage that simmered just beneath the surface was rapidly boiling over. You slept with him? Brian growled, the disbelief and fury intertwining in his voice. You cheated on me? With a criminal? Eliza crumbled, sobbing uncontrollably, but Brian felt no pity. Only anger. The woman he had trusted, loved, and shared his life with for over a decade had betrayed him in the worst possible way. And not just with any man, but with someone who was dangerous, someone who had brought the police to their home, threatening to destroy everything they had built together. If you have no idea what you've done, Brian spat, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury, but you've not only ruined our marriage, you've put our lives in danger. Eliza reached for him, but Brian stepped back, avoiding her touch like it was poison. He couldn't bear to be near her, to see her face, knowing what she had done. His hands balled into fists, knuckles white with tension as he struggled to hold himself together. But the officer shifted uncomfortably, sensing the raw emotion between the couple. One of them cleared his throat. We'll need to take Mrs. Turner in for questioning. We'll be in touch once we have more information. Brian nodded stiffly, unable to take his eyes off Eliza. She was still sobbing, pleading with him for forgiveness, but her words barely registered in his mind. He felt numb, hollowed out by the betrayal. The love he once felt for her had been replaced with a cold, bitter rage. As the officers escorted Eliza out of the house, Brian stood frozen in place, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal, guilt, and despair. His life had just been shattered into a million pieces, and he wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to put them back together. The front door closed behind the officers, and Brian was left alone in the dimly lit house. The silence was deafening. Brian stood motionless, staring at the closed door, the echo of Eliza's sobs still hanging in the air. His wife, Eliza, was gone, taken away by the police. The house, once filled with the warmth of their life together, now felt like a cold, unfamiliar place. He could still hear the officers' voices, replaying the words that shattered everything. Conrad O'Brien, criminal investigation, your wife's name came up. His heart pounded, each beat like a hammer driving home the reality of her betrayal. Eliza had cheated on him with Conrad O'Brien, a man involved in criminal activity. The woman he had built his life around, the woman he thought he knew, had lied to him, deceived him, and put their lives in danger. Brian turned slowly, his eyes scanning the living room, the photographs on the mantelpiece of him and Eliza at the beach, laughing and holding hands. Family trips, Christmases together. Each picture felt like a cruel reminder of the illusion he had been living in. He felt sick to his stomach. How long had this been going on? The question gnawed at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. He needed answers more than the weak, tear-soaked apologies Eliza had managed to stammer through before being taken away. He needed the truth. But deep down, he knew that the truth would only destroy him further. Brian paced the room, his thoughts racing. He tried to piece together the moments that now seemed like glaring red flags for strange late-night phone calls, the sudden, unexplained absences, the excuses about work that never quite added up. It was all there, right in front of him, but he had been too blind to see it. How could I have been so stupid? He thought bitterly, his fists clenching in frustration. He was a lawyer. He made a living out of uncovering lies, reading between the lines, catching people in their deception. And yet, he hadn't seen this coming. His own wife had outsmarted him. He walked into the kitchen, needing to move, to do something, anything to escape the crushing weight of what had just happened. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking as he drank. The cold liquid did little to calm the fire burning inside him. His mind flashed back to earlier that evening, before the doorbell, before the police, before everything fell apart. Eliza had been distant, distracted, but he had brushed it off. He had trusted her. God, he had trusted her so much. Brian slammed the glass down on the counter, the sound echoing through the silent kitchen. Who the hell is Conrad O'Brien? The name felt like poison on his tongue. He needed to know more. What kind of man had come into his wife's life and turned her against him? Grabbing his phone, Brian hesitated for a moment. Did he really want to dig into this? Did he want to know all the dirty details of her betrayal? The thought of Eliza in another man's arms, Conrad's arms, made his skin crawl. But he had no choice. He had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Brian began searching Conrad O'Brien's name on his phone. The results flooded in articles, news reports, crime blogs. He scrolled through them, his stomach twisting with each new revelation. Conrad wasn't just a petty criminal. He was a notorious figure in the underworld, a man with connections to drug cartels, illegal gambling rings, and money laundering operations. The police had been after him for years, but he always managed to slip through the cracks. And Eliza, my Eliza, she was involved with this guy? Brian's disbelief turned into disgust. How could she have been so reckless, so stupid? Had she really thought she could carry on an affair with someone like Conrad and get away with it? So what the hell was she thinking? As he continued reading, his heart sank lower. Conrad had been linked to violent incidents. People who crossed him didn't just disappear, they were erased. There were stories of bodies turning up in ditches, homes burned to the ground as warnings. This wasn't some harmless fling Eliza had fallen into. She had involved herself with a dangerous, ruthless man. Brian's thoughts shifted back to the police visit. If they were at his house, if they were questioning Eliza, it meant they were close to bringing Conrad down. And now his wife was tangled in the mess. How deep was she involved? Was she just another pawn in Conrad's game, or was she deeper in his world than Brian could ever imagine? He slammed the phone down on the counter, the rage building inside him again. How could she do this to me? To us, the marriage he thought was strong, solid, had been a lie. Every kiss, every I love you she'd whispered in the dark was tainted now. How long had she been playing him for a fool? Brian stormed into the living room, pacing again, the familiar walls now feeling like a prison. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stay here, in this house, surrounded by the memories of their life together, knowing it was all built on lies. He needed to confront her, to make her explain how she had let this happen. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from one of the officers who had been at the house. They were holding Eliza for questioning. She hadn't been formally charged yet, but they wanted to keep her in custody while they dug deeper into her involvement with Conrad. Good, Brian thought bitterly. Let her sit in that cold, sterile room and think about what she'd done. He wasn't going to bail her out. Not this time. She could deal with the consequences of her choices on her own. The anger bubbled up again, but this time it was mixed with something darker and emptiness that settled in his chest, gnawing at him from the inside out. He had loved her. Despite everything, He had loved her so much. And now that love felt like a wound, deep and festering, and he wasn't sure if it would ever heal. Brian sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. He wanted to scream, to break something, but all he could do was sit there, paralyzed by the weight of his pain. The woman he had trusted with his heart, with his life, had betrayed him in the worst way possible, and now he wasn't sure how he was going to pick up the pieces. Brian sat on the couch for what felt like hours, the weight of the night pressing down on him like a heavy fog. His thoughts were a tangled mess, an endless loop of how and why. He couldn't shake the image of Eliza being led away by the police, the woman he had trusted with every piece of himself, now reduced to a crying, trembling figure in handcuffs. His phone buzzed again, pulling him back to the present. It was a message from a colleague, someone asking if he was okay, concerned about the police presence at his house. He ignored it, tossing the phone aside. He couldn't deal with anything or anyone right now. All he could think about was her. And him. Conrad O'Brien. The name still burned in his brain, a constant reminder of how completely his life had fallen apart. Brian wanted to hate Eliza, to hate her for the lies, the betrayal, and the danger she brought into their lives, but something in him wouldn't let go of the love he still felt for her. It was twisted now, corrupted by her actions, but it was still there, festering alongside the rage and disbelief. He stood abruptly, the sudden motion making his head spin. He needed airspace. Grabbing his jacket, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The cool night air hit his face, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside him. Brian walked down the street, his footsteps heavy on the pavement, his mind racing. He needed answers. He needed to know how long this had been going on, what Eliza had been thinking. But most of all, he needed to understand why. Why Conrad? Why risk everything we had for a man like him? He wandered aimlessly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, the neighborhood dark and quiet around him. The weight of what had happened was suffocating. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to feel anything other than this crushing sense of betrayal. Eventually, he found himself standing outside a small bar. It wasn't the kind of place Brian normally went to. He preferred classy spots with good wine and well-dressed patrons, but tonight, the dimly lit dive felt like the perfect place to drown his sorrows. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the low hum of conversation. Brian slipped onto a stool at the bar, ordering a whiskey neat. The bartender barely glanced at him as he poured the drink, sliding it across the counter. Brian knocked it back in one go, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the chaos in his mind. As the alcohol warmed his chest, Brian's thoughts drifted back to Eliza. He remembered their wedding day, how beautiful she had looked walking down the aisle, the way her eyes had sparkled with love and promise. He remembered the birth of their first child, the long nights they spent together, the way they had laughed through the sleepless exhaustion. Had all of it been a lie? Or had something changed in her, something that he had missed? He stared into his empty glass, the question swirling in his head. How had he not seen this coming? Eliza had always been careful, measured in her actions, the perfect partner. He had never doubted her loyalty, not once in all the years they had been married. But now it felt like their entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. She had been keeping secrets dark, dangerous secrets, and he had been blind to all of it. The bartender refilled his glass without a word, and Brian downed it just as quickly. The alcohol dulled the edge of his thoughts, but it couldn't erase the pain. Nothing could erase the pain. She slept with him. The thought punched him in the gut again. No matter how much he drank, he couldn't escape the image of Eliza in Conrad's arms. He pictured her with him, Conrad, the criminal, the man who had brought the police to their door, holding her, touching her. The thought made Brian's blood boil. What had Conrad offered her that he couldn't? Thrills? Danger? Was Brian not enough for her anymore? The questions kept coming, each one a fresh wound, each one deepening the pit of despair he was sinking into. Brian slammed the glass down on the bar, the loud thud drawing a glance from the bartender. He signaled for another, his hand shaking. The rage was growing, bubbling just beneath the surface, threatening to explode. He had loved Eliza. He had trusted her. And she had thrown it all away for a man like Conrad O'Brien, a man who was nothing but trouble. A man who didn't care about her, about them, about the life they had built together. The bartender placed the fresh drink in front of him, and Brian stared at it, his vision blurring slightly from the alcohol. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of anger and confusion. He wanted to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense anymore. Taking a deep breath, Brian tried to clear his mind. He knew he couldn't stay here, drowning his sorrows in whiskey. He needed to figure out what to do next. He needed a plan, confront her. The thought cut through the haze in his mind. He needed to talk to Eliza to get the full story. The police had taken her away, but they hadn't charged her with anything yet. She was probably sitting in some cold, sterile interrogation room, scared out of her mind. But Brian didn't care about her fear. He cared about the truth. He needed to know how deep this went. Was it just an affair, or was she involved in something worse? Something criminal. All?
Brian pushed the glass away, standing up from the bar stool. The room swayed slightly as he rose, but he steadied himself, determined to stay in control. He tossed a few bills on the counter and headed for the door, the cold night air hitting him like a slap to the face as he stepped outside.
The walk back to the house was a blur, his mind still spinning, the whiskey clouding his thoughts. By the time he reached the front steps, Brian's anger had simmered down to a cold, hard resolve. He would get his answers, no matter what it took. Inside, the house was dark and silent. The life that had once filled its rooms felt like a distant memory, a cruel joke now that Brian knew the truth. He made his way upstairs to the bedroom, his feet heavy, his heart even heavier. As he stepped into the room, the familiar scent of Eliza's perfume hit him. It was faint, but it was enough to bring back a flood of memories, nights spent wrapped in each other's arms, mornings where they had whispered promises of forever. But forever was gone now. Brian sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He had spent years building a life with Eliza, trusting her, loving her, and now it had all been torn apart in a single night. The silence of the house was suffocating, and for the first time in his life, Brian didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to move forward. He didn't know if he could move forward. He reached for his phone, his hand still shaking. He needed to hear from the police to know what was happening with Eliza. But as he stared at the screen, he realized something he didn't even know if he wanted her to come back. The next morning, the sunlight poured into the bedroom, mocking Brian's sleepless night. He hadn't even bothered to crawl under the covers, just sat on the edge of the bed for hours, staring at nothing, his mind churning through every detail of the nightmare that had become his life. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, the harsh sound cutting through the silence. Brian glanced at the screen, his stomach knotting as he saw the number. It was the police station. With a shaky hand, he picked it up. "Mr. Turner." The officer's voice came through the line, calm and official. "We finished questioning your wife. She's being released, but we'll need her to remain available as our investigation into Conrad O'Brien continues." Brian swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure he was ready. "Okay, I'll come get her." The officer gave him the details, but Brian barely heard them. He was already thinking about what he would say to Eliza when he saw her. What could he say? The words felt useless, small compared to the storm of emotions inside him: anger, betrayal, despair, and somewhere buried deep beneath it all, love. Brian grabbed his keys and headed to the car. The drive to the police station was a blur, his heart pounding in his chest as the reality of what was about to happen settled over him. So he was going to see her Eliza, the woman who had destroyed their marriage, their life. Though what would she say? Would she try to justify it? Would she cry and beg for his forgiveness? His thoughts twisted and turned, but they always came back to one thing: he needed the truth. No more lies, no more half answers. He needed to hear it all, raw and real, no matter how much it hurt. When he arrived at the station, he was led into a small waiting area. The walls were pale and cold, much like the way he felt inside. He didn't have to wait long. Soon, Eliza appeared in the doorway, escorted by one of the officers. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked smaller, diminished, like the weight of everything had finally crushed her. For a brief moment, Brian felt a pang of sympathy. She looked fragile, broken, but then the memory of her betrayal surged to the surface, and the sympathy was quickly replaced by cold, hard anger. "Brian," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped toward him, but Brian didn't move. He couldn't. His body felt frozen, every muscle tight, his mind battling between the instinct to comfort her and the need to lash out. "Let's go," he said curtly, not meeting her eyes as he turned toward the exit. Eliza followed him in silence, her steps hesitant, like she was afraid of what was waiting for her outside. The ride home was quiet, the tension between them palpable. Brian gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He could feel Eliza stealing glances at him, but he refused to look at her. His thoughts were a mess, emotions raging beneath the surface, but he needed to stay calm. He needed to hold it together. They pulled into the driveway, the house standing there like a monument to the life they had once shared, a life that now felt so distant, so impossible to return to. Brian got out of the car, slamming the door behind him, and walked into the house without waiting for Eliza. On side, he stood in the living room, his hands on his hips, his back to the door, till he heard her footsteps behind him as she entered, the door clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the house. Brian, her voice was soft, pleading, but he wasn't ready to hear it yet. "Sit down," he said sharply, still not turning to face her. He couldn't bear to see her just yet, to look into the eyes of the woman who had torn his world apart. Eliza obeyed, sinking onto the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked small and scared, but Brian knew better now. He had seen the other side of her, the side capable of deception, of keeping secrets that could destroy them both. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This was it. The moment he had been dreading, the moment he needed more than anything. "Tell me everything," Brian said, his voice low and hard. "No more lies. No more half-truths. I want to know exactly what happened." Eliza's lip quivered as she looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the fabric of her shirt. For a moment, she didn't speak, the silence between them thick and suffocating. But then, slowly, haltingly, she began to talk. "So it started about a year ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I met Conrad through a friend at work. So at first, it was nothing, just casual conversation, small talk. But then it changed." Brian stood still, his jaw tight, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't interrupt. He wanted to hear it all. I didn't plan for it to happen, Brian. I swear I didn't. But he was different. He made me feel things I hadn't felt in a long time." Eliza's voice cracked, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. "I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I felt trapped, stuck in the same routine, the same life, and I was weak. I let it happen." Brian clenched his fists, the rage bubbling up inside him. Weak, that's what she was going with. She had wrecked their marriage, their family, and she wanted him to believe it was because she had felt weak. "And what about the crimes, Eliza?" Brian's voice was sharp, cutting through her sobs. "What about Conrad's involvement in all of this? How deep are you in?" Eliza flinched at his tone, but she didn't look away this time. Her eyes were wide, scared. "I didn't know at first," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know he was involved in all of that. But by the time I found out, it was too late. I was in too deep." Brian felt like he had been punched in the gut. The woman he had shared his life with, the mother of his children, had gotten involved with a criminal, and now she was telling him it had been too late to stop. "What does that mean, Eliza?" Brian demanded, his voice rising. "What the hell does in too deep mean?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt. "I was helping him. I didn't realize it at first, but I was moving money for him. I thought it was just, I don't know what I thought. But when I realized what was happening, I was already involved. If I tried to back out, I was scared, Brian. I didn't know what to do." Brian stared at her, his mind reeling. Eliza hadn't just cheated on him, she had become part of a criminal operation. His wife was a criminal, tangled in the dangerous web of Conrad O'Brien's world. "I don't even know who you are anymore," Brian said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman sitting on the couch in front of him felt like a stranger. "I didn't want any of this," Eliza cried, tears streaming down her face. I was lost, Brian, and I made a terrible mistake." Brian's heart pounded in his chest, the anger mixing with the deep, profound sadness. He had come into this confrontation looking for answers, but now that he had them, he wasn't sure what to do with them. The woman he had loved, the life they had shared, it was all gone. It had been slipping away long before Conrad O'Brien came into the picture, and now it was too late to save any of it. "Get out," Brian said, his voice hollow. Eliza froze, her eyes wide with shock. "Brian, please. Get out." The words were final, cold, and unmoving. Brian couldn't stand to look at her anymore, couldn't stand to be in the same room as her. Eliza sobbed, but she stood, wiping her face with trembling hands. She moved toward the door, her footsteps slow and hesitant, but Brian didn't turn around. He couldn't. The sound of the door closing behind her felt like the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. And just like that, she was gone. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in what felt like ages, the house was silent. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence Brian had grown used to over the years, the kind that followed a long day, where he and Eliza would sit together, unwinding in comfortable quiet. No, this silence was oppressive, heavy. It clung to the walls, thick in the air, and pressed down on his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. Brian stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where Eliza had been only seconds ago. The woman he had built his life around, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone, was gone. And with her, the life they had together. He had forced her to leave, but the truth was she had already left long before tonight. In her heart, in her choices, she had walked away from their marriage the moment she fell into Conrad O'Brien's world. The house felt hollow without her, but even when she had been there, things had already started to feel empty. Brian's knees buckled under him, and he sank into the armchair in the corner, his head dropping into his hands. He could still feel the tension in the air from their confrontation, the cold reality of everything she had told him, the cheating, the lies, the criminal involvement. He couldn't stop replaying her words in his mind. "I was in too deep. I was scared. I made a mistake. A mistake." That's what she had called it. Brian's body shook with silent rage, but behind that fury was something deeper, more painful, a profound sense of loss. Eliza wasn't just some woman he had loved. She was his partner, his best friend, the person he had shared every moment of his adult life with. They had built a life together, a home, a family, a future, and now all of that felt like it had been ripped away. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, his chest tight. How had they ended up here? How had he missed all the signs that his wife was slipping away from him, falling into the arms of another man, a man who had dragged her into something so dark and dangerous? The answers didn't come. Just more questions, more guilt, more pain. Brian rubbed his face, the exhaustion settling in. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. His body felt numb, his mind clouded by the chaos of everything that had happened. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he opened the message from the police station, confirming that Eliza had been officially released, pending further investigation into her involvement with Conrad O'Brien. There it was in black and white. Eliza was free, but only for now. She wasn't out of the woods yet. The police were going to keep digging, keep investigating, and it was only a matter of time before they came back with more questions, more revelations. And where would that leave him? Stuck in the middle of a nightmare he never asked for. Brian's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from his friend and colleague David. He hesitated before answering, not sure if he could handle a conversation with anyone right now. But he pressed the answer button, bringing the phone to his ear. "Brian, man, are you okay?" David's voice was filled with concern, and Brian could hear the genuine worry behind his friend's words. "I heard about what happened. Is it true? About Eliza?" Brian closed his eyes, the wave of shame hitting him. He didn't want to talk about this, didn't want to admit the truth to anyone, let alone himself. "It's true," he said finally, his voice hoarse from the strain. She was involved with someone, a criminal." Jesus, man," David said softly, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. "I don't even know what to say. I'm so sorry." Brian nodded, even though David couldn't see him. He didn't know what to say either. He hadn't known for days. His entire life had become a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal, and he didn't have a single answer for any of it. "I kicked her out," Brian said, the words falling out of his mouth before he could stop them. I couldn't stand to look at her anymore." David was silent for a moment, as if weighing his response. "That's understandable, man. She betrayed you. She put you in danger. It's natural to want her gone." So Brian rubbed his eyes, the exhaustion settling in deeper now. I can't believe this is happening. And I can't believe she could do this to us." "I know," David said quietly. "I know, but you're going to get through this, Brian. You're strong, and I'll be here for you, whatever you need." Brian swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "Thanks, David." And they talked for a few more minutes before Brian ended the call, sinking back into the chair, staring at the floor. The house was so quiet. Too quiet. He wanted to get out, to run away from the silence, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to escape. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what came next. Divorce. That seemed inevitable now. How could they come back from this? Eliza had not only destroyed their marriage, but she had put his entire life in danger by getting involved with someone like Conrad O'Brien. And then there was the shame, the unbearable weight of knowing that people knew, that their friends and family were probably already talking about it. "Did you hear about Eliza? She cheated on Brian with a criminal." The gossip would spread like wildfire, and Brian would have to live with the humiliation. He stood up, pacing the living room, the walls feeling like they were closing in on him. The memories of their life together were everywhere, the framed photos on the mantle, the small knickknacks they had collected on vacations, the little things that made this house a home. Now it all felt like a lie. Brian's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his sister Karen. She had heard the news too, apparently. "I'm so sorry, Brian. Please let me know if you need anything. I'm here for you." Brian stared at the message for a long time, his emotions churning. He hadn't told anyone, yet not his family, not even his kids, who were away at college. How would he explain this to them? How could he tell them that their mother, the woman they adored, had betrayed them all? He felt sick at the thought of it, at the idea of shattering their perception of Eliza. But the truth couldn't be hidden. It was out there now, and sooner or later he would have to face the reality of what had happened. And Brian collapsed back into the chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him again. That he had never felt so lost, so unsure of what to do next. The woman he had trusted with everything had lied to him, cheated on him, and dragged him into a dangerous world that he didn't belong in. And now he was left with the wreckage of it all. Brian spent the next few hours going through the motions, cleaning the kitchen, doing laundry, trying to distract himself from the crushing reality that Eliza wasn't coming back. Not really. Even if she physically returned, the version of her he had known and loved was gone, replaced by someone who had made choices that would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. As the day turned into evening, Brian found himself sitting in the dark, the glow of the television casting faint shadows across the room. He wasn't watching it, though. His mind was too busy running through the list of what had to be done. Divorce. He would need to contact a lawyer, get the paperwork started. They would have to figure out the logistics, splitting assets, dealing with the house, informing the kids. And what about Conrad? Would the police come back? Would Eliza's involvement with him drag Brian further into the mess? The future looked bleak, a landscape of endless legal battles and painful conversations. But there was no other way forward. Brian couldn't forgive her. He couldn't forget what she had done. The house felt too big, too empty. It wasn't home anymore, just a shell of what it had been before everything fell apart. The next morning, the cold, gray light filtered through the blinds as Brian sat at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He had been up all night, unable to sleep, unable to shake the overwhelming numbness that had settled deep into his bones. This was it, the beginning of the end. He needed to plan his next steps, and that meant facing what he had been avoiding for the past few days. Divorce. It was inevitable now. There was no going back. Not after everything Eliza had done, not after the lies, the affair, the danger she had brought into their lives. Their marriage was beyond saving, and Brian knew it. But knowing it and accepting it were two very different things. He had loved her once. Hell, a part of him still loved her, but love wasn't enough anymore. So not after the betrayal, not after the way she had shattered everything they had built together. Brian had spent his life believing in the strength of their relationship, believing that they could weather any storm. Now, he felt like a fool. The sound of his phone vibrating on the table jolted him out of his thoughts. It was another message from David, but he had been checking in on Brian almost hourly since their last conversation, offering support, advice, and a shoulder to lean on. Brian appreciated it, but it did little to dull the ache inside him. Brian, we need to talk about what happens next. Have you spoken to a lawyer yet? David's message read. Brian stared at the text for a long moment before typing out a response. Not yet. I'll call someone today. But he hit send and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He knew he needed to make that call to get the ball rolling on the divorce, but it felt so final, so irreversible. As much as he knew it had to be done, there was still a part of him that clung to the past, to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen the truth in Eliza's eyes when she confessed everything, the affair with Conrad, her involvement in his criminal activities, the lies she had been telling for months. There was no coming back from that. The damage was done. Brian stood up, pacing the kitchen, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The house felt suffocating, every corner filled with memories of a life that no longer existed. He couldn't stay here, surrounded by the ghosts of their marriage. He needed to get out, clear his head. Grabbing his keys, Brian left the house, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The air outside was crisp, the sky overcast, but it felt good to be moving, to be doing something other than sitting in that suffocating silence. As he drove through the quiet suburban city, his mind wandered back to Eliza. He hadn't heard from her since the confrontation, and part of him wondered where she was, what she was doing. Is she thinking about him? About their marriage? Or was she still wrapped up in Conrad's world, too far gone to care? The thought made his stomach twist with a familiar ache. He hated that he still cared, hated that she still had this power over him, even after everything she had done. But no matter how much he tried to push the feelings away, they clung to him, a constant reminder of the love they had shared and the pain that now replaced it. Brian pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe on the edge of town. He had come here often, back when things were simpler, back when his biggest worry was making it home in time for dinner with Eliza, and now it felt like a different world. He sat down at a table near the window, ordering a coffee, his mind still racing. Divorce. It loomed over him like a dark cloud, and yet he couldn't seem to move forward. The phone in his pocket felt like a weight, and he knew he needed to make the call to speak to a lawyer, to start the process of untangling their lives from one another. But for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to do it. His thoughts drifted back to their kids, away at college, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had unfolded in their parents' lives. How would he tell them? How would he explain that their mother had betrayed him, that their family was falling apart? Brian leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. He had never felt so lost, so unsure of what to do next. The pain of Eliza's betrayal was like a wound that wouldn't heal, and every day it seemed to cut deeper. The coffee arrived and Brian took a sip, the warmth doing little to chase away the cold inside him. He glanced out the window, watching as people passed by, ordinary people living their ordinary lives, unaware of the hell he was going through. He envied them, their simplicity, their peace. He wished he could go back to that, to a time when his biggest worry was a work deadline or planning their next family vacation. But that life was gone. The future he had imagined with Eliza, the future he had worked so hard to build, had crumbled into nothing. And now he was left standing in the rubble, unsure of how to rebuild. Brian pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for, a divorce attorney he had been recommended. As his finger hovered over the call button, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. the final step. Once he made the call, there was no going back. Everything would be set in motion, and the life he had known would officially be over. He took a deep breath, his finger trembling as he pressed the button. The phone rang, each ring echoing in his ears like a countdown. Finally, the line clicked, and a voice on the other end greeted him. Law offices of Peterson and Burke, how can I help you today? Brian hesitated for a moment, his throat tightening. Then, finally, he found his voice. I need to speak to someone about filing for divorce. The process began slowly. The days blurred together, each one filled with calls to lawyers, meetings, and endless paperwork. Brian went through the motions, signing documents, answering questions, but all of it felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life fall apart. Eliza tried reaching out a few times, calls, texts, messages filled with apologies, but Brian couldn't bring himself to answer. What was there to say? What could she possibly say that would make any of this better? Nothing. It was over. So in the weeks that followed, Brian found himself packing up the house. He couldn't stay there, it was too full of memories, too tied to a life that no longer existed. He packed boxes of photos, trinkets, clothes, each item a reminder of what they had once been, of the love that had once filled these rooms. It felt like he was burying their past, putting it all away to make room for the future, whatever that would be. But even as he packed, even as the divorce papers moved closer to being finalized, Brian couldn't shake the hollow feeling inside him. The betrayal, the lies, it had all left a scar that would take years to heal. Maybe it would never heal. On the day the divorce was finalized, Brian stood in front of the courthouse, the official document in his hand. It was over. Legally, officially over. He stared at the paper, his mind numb. He had thought this moment would bring some sense of closure, some relief, but it didn't. It just felt empty. He thought about Eliza, where she was, what she was doing. She hadn't shown up to the final hearing, choosing instead to have her lawyer handle everything. He hadn't seen her since that night, and part of him was glad. He didn't want to see her, didn't want to face the person who had destroyed everything. But as he stood there, the weight of it all pressing down on him, he realized something. And this wasn't just the end of his marriage, it was the end of who he had been. The man who had trusted so completely, who had believed in love, in forever. That man was gone now, replaced by someone else. Someone harder, someone more cautious, someone who knew just how fragile love could be. He folded the paper, slipping it into his pocket, and turned away from the courthouse. The future stretched out before him, uncertain and unfamiliar. But for the first time in weeks, Brian felt a flicker of something else, something that had been missing for too long. Hope.